There's something different about what happens after midnight. When the city quiets down and the streets empty out, taxi drivers become silent witnesses to the kind of stories no one ever wants to hear, let alone live. While the world sleeps, they pick up passengers with secrets carved into their skin, with voices that don't match their faces, and sometimes with eyes that no longer belong to the living. These aren't just creepy encounters. These are real nightmares behind the wheel, across dusty highways, fog-drenched cemeteries, and neighborhoods long forgotten by the map. These men and women found themselves tangled in something darker than crime, things that reason can't explain and prayer can barely touch. Some met passengers who vanished without opening the door. Others drove people who'd already been declared dead. And a cursed few, looked into the rearview mirror and saw something staring back that wasn't human. You're about to hear 12 stories, all different, all disturbing. Some are soaked in blood, others are wrapped in silence, but they all share one terrifying truth. Once you let the wrong soul into your car, they don't always leave. What started as ordinary shifts turned into nights filled with screams, rituals, apparitions, and unspeakable choices. These drivers weren't just witnesses. They became part of something that rides in the back seat of memory and never gets out. So buckle up, check the back seat, and whatever you do, don't answer if someone whispers your name from the darkness. It was a cold night in El Paso, Texas. Marco, a taxi driver with over 15 years of experience, was making his final rounds before calling it a day. Around 3 a.m., he spotted a man waving from the middle of an empty desert lot, surrounded by weeds and flickering streetlights. The nearest lamppost buzzed and pulsed, casting jagged shadows over the cracked pavement. Marco hesitated. Something felt off, but the need to hit his daily earnings pushed him forward. The man looked in a hurry, clutching a large black suitcase, smeared with dirt. He slid into the back seat and simply said, "Drive, fast." Marco glanced at him through the rearview mirror and immediately felt a chill crawl up his spine. The man's voice was flat, emotionless, and his eyes seemed disconnected from the world around him. He placed the suitcase beside him with unsettling care, like it held something delicate or dangerous. The ride was quiet, the streets nearly deserted, just the hum of the engine and distant desert winds. Marco tried making small talk, but the man only responded with short, cold commands. Then a faint sound came from the suitcase, a muffled groan or whisper. Marco pretended he hadn't heard. They arrived at a shadowy street, lined with old warehouses, windows broken, walls marked with graffiti. The man paid in crumpled, stained bills and stepped out quickly, dragging the suitcase into one of the buildings without another word. Marco sped off, his heart pounding, trying to convince himself he'd imagined the sound, but his conscience wouldn't rest. The next morning, curiosity or guilt drew him back to the site. In daylight, the area looked even worse. Rusted, barrels, broken glass, silence. The warehouse door was ajar. Lying beside a barrel was the same suitcase, partially open. Marco approached cautiously, hands trembling. A faint cry came from inside the suitcase. He unzipped it and recoiled in shock. Inside was a young woman, bloody and barely conscious, duct tape over her mouth, eyes wide with terror. He screamed for help, and nearby workers rushed to call 911. The woman was rushed to the hospital, critically injured but alive. Days later, police arrested the man attempting to cross the state line. They confirmed what Marco feared. If he hadn't returned, the woman would have died alone in that abandoned place. News of the case spread fast. Local stations called Marco a hero, but he declined every interview. "It wasn't courage," he said. "Something just told me to go back." After that night, his taxi felt different, heavier, colder, like it had absorbed the trauma. At times he swore he felt a presence in the back seat, even when driving alone. Shadows moved in mirrors that weren't there. Once he thought he saw her reflection in the rearview, eyes pleading for help. Sleep became rare. Marco only drove during the day now, afraid of what the night might bring. He avoided that part of town completely. The memory of the man's empty stare and the sound of that groan haunted him. It wasn't just a close call. It was something darker, something that reached beyond the physical. The woman had lived, but Marco believed she left something behind in his cab. He tried cleansing it, cleaning, incense, even prayer, but nothing worked. Anytime he picked up a passenger with a suitcase, dread took over his body. His hands would shake uncontrollably. Word spread among other drivers. Some refused to pick up fares near desert lots. A few claimed they'd seen a woman wandering near the warehouse in the early hours, dressed in white, her steps dragging. Others spoke of static noises and crying babies coming through their radios, always around 3 a.m. The story became legend among El Paso cab drivers, but Marco knew it wasn't a story. Evil walks among us, sometimes disguised in clean shirts with suitcases full of horror. By the end of the year, Marco quit driving altogether. He told his wife it was for health reasons, but deep down, he knew the truth. He sold the car to a stranger who returned it a week later, pale and shaken, claiming the vehicle wasn't right. Marco never asked what happened. He never wanted to see that car or that warehouse again. But every night, when sirens wail in the distance, he freezes. And he knows somewhere out there that evil still moves in silence, waiting for the next desperate driver. It was a foggy evening when Daniel, a night shift taxi driver in San Antonio, Texas, received a call from a quiet neighborhood near Mission Burial Park. The pickup location was by a small church, the kind tourists often visit during the day, but avoid after sundown. When he arrived, a young woman in her early 20s stood near the gate, dressed in a pale blue dress that looked dated, like something from the 1980s. She smiled politely, got into the back seat, and softly said, "To the cemetery, please." Her voice had a calm sadness, almost like she was whispering through a memory. Daniel glanced at her in the mirror. Her eyes were distant, fixed outside the window as the car rolled through dim streets. She clutched a single flower in her hand, a white rose, fresh and dripping with dew. "I'm going to see my father," she explained softly. "He passed not long ago." Daniel offered his condolences, but the girl didn't say another word. As they approached the cemetery, the fog thickened unnaturally fast, and Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. He suddenly felt cold, though the heater was on. When they reached the entrance of the cemetery, the woman thanked him, opened the door, and stepped out. She turned back, handed him a folded $20 bill and smiled. "Thank you," she said. "I just needed to say goodbye." Daniel nodded, watching her walk into the cemetery through the iron gate. The fog swallowed her figure almost immediately. Something felt strange, but he drove off, assuming grief had made her behave oddly. Only later did he realize that the gate had been locked the whole time, chained shut with a heavy padlock. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the way she vanished into the mist. The next morning, curiosity led him back to the cemetery. He approached the caretaker, asking if the gates had been opened the night before. The man shook his head. "No one comes in after 6 p.m. We keep it locked." Daniel described the girl and mentioned she said she was visiting her father's grave. The caretaker's face paled. He led Daniel to a nearby tombstone, barely covered in fallen leaves and soft moss. It was her. Her name was carved in stone. The photo on the headstone showed the same pale woman with haunting eyes and a gentle smile. The death date was the day before the ride. "She died yesterday," the caretaker confirmed. "A car accident. Her father died last year. They're buried together now." Daniel staggered back, staring at the grave. The flower she carried was now resting on the tombstone, still fresh. He checked his wallet. The $20 bill was gone. In its place was a white petal, folded neatly. From that day on, Daniel became a different man. He avoided nighttime fares unless absolutely necessary. His co-workers teased him about the ghost girl, but the story clung to his mind like wet fog. Some nights he swore he saw her reflection in the rear view, just for a second. She'd sit silently, eyes lost in thought, holding that same white rose. Then she'd vanish the moment he blinked. Daniel never visited the cemetery again. The memory was too sharp, too real. Rumors spread among local drivers. Others claimed to have picked up passengers near cemeteries who vanished before. Reaching their destinations, one driver found dried rose petals scattered in the back seat after a foggy night shift. Another said his radio picked up faint sobbing whenever he passed a certain church. Daniel tried to ignore the stories, but each one echoed his own experience too closely. It was like the boundary between the living and the dead blurred on those roads. Eventually, Daniel put a cross on his dashboard and stopped picking up fares from churches or cemeteries. He said it wasn't out of fear, just precaution, but inside he knew better. The night he met that girl, something shifted. He'd driven thousands of passengers, but never one who had already crossed to the other side. And though she never harmed him, her presence unsettled something deep in his soul. A soft goodbye from someone who shouldn't have spoken again. To this day, Daniel keeps his car spotless, always checking the back seat before he starts a ride. Not for safety, but for signs, petals, whispers, or sudden cold. It's become a routine, almost sacred. He tells no one, but every time he starts the engine, he whispers, "Only the living, please," just in case. Because in San Antonio's misty streets, you never really know who's waiting by the curb. In the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona, Luis drove the night shift like he always did, trying to make ends meet for his growing family. It was a Friday, just past midnight, when he picked up two sharply dressed men near a closed-down mall. They looked like businessmen, but their eyes were wrong, void of warmth. "We need to go out past the city limits," one said calmly. The other placed a folded $100 bill on the dashboard. Luis hesitated. Something about the silence between them, the intensity of their gaze, felt off. But the money was too good, and he nodded without a word. They drove for nearly 30 minutes into the desert, with no signal and only moonlight guiding them past cacti and brush. The road turned to dirt. Luis asked twice for a destination, but was met with silence. The men whispered to each other, occasionally laughing under their breath. Just as Luis decided to turn back, one of them leaned forward. "Stop here," he said. In the distance, a rundown house stood like a carcass on the horizon. Roof caved in, windows shattered, a faint orange glow pulsing from within. Luis's heart sank. They got out and told him to leave the engine running. One of them opened his door and with a sudden shift in tone added, "Actually, why don't you come inside for a minute?" Luis laughed nervously, declining. That's when the man pulled a gun. "Inside," he repeated. Trembling, Luis obeyed. The desert was silent except for the soft wind scraping against the abandoned house. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and something metallic. A candle-lit altar flickered in the center of the room, surrounded by symbols drawn in what looked like blood. In the corner, Luis saw two other men tied up, gagged, eyes wide with fear. A woman in a red cloak circled the altar, chanting in a language he didn't recognize. The two men who had forced him inside now stood at each side of the altar, removing their jackets and revealing strange symbols carved into their skin. Luis froze. Every instinct screamed to run, but he couldn't move. The woman looked directly at him and smiled. "We were waiting for the last one," she whispered. "The offering must be complete." Before anything could happen, a loud bang shattered the room. Flashlights burst through the windows as military boots stormed the house. Gunfire followed. Someone tackled Luis to the floor, shouting orders in Spanish and English. Within seconds, the entire ritual was interrupted. The captives were rescued, the cultists arrested. A military truck outside bore the emblem of a border patrol division. Luis lay in shock on the floor, heart racing, his mind unable to grasp what had just happened. One of the soldiers pulled him up and said, "You were lucky tonight." Later, at the station, Luis learned the authorities had been tracking the cult for weeks. They'd intercepted a call and followed the men, arriving just in time. The victims, all drivers, had vanished over the past month. Luis was the only one who had been taken in a functioning taxi. The woman in red had been wanted for years, linked to disappearances across the border. Luis gave his statement, still trembling, unable to process that he was almost sacrificed in some kind of ritual. The officers told him to take a few days off. Luis never drove at night again. The glow of candles, the smell of blood, and that haunting chant haunted his sleep. He burned the clothes he wore that night and had his car deep cleaned twice. Still, something lingered. His radio would flicker with static during dusk, sometimes catching whispers that no one else heard. On rare occasions, he thought he saw the red cloak in passing reflections. It was as if a part of the ritual had marked him. He tried to forget, but the desert never forgets. Other drivers whispered about what happened, but no one ever asked Luis directly. Those who knew respected his silence. The abandoned house was demolished, but locals claimed the area still gave off a strange heat, even in winter. Animals avoided the land. A young officer who'd been at the scene later quit the force and moved states. Some things, he said, are not meant to be stopped, just delayed. Luis believed him. What he saw wasn't just a crime. It was a glimpse into something far older. Years passed, and Luis now worked at a mechanic shop, far from the wheel. But every time he passed a lone passenger, asking to be taken far outside the city, something inside him recoiled. He knew too, well, what might wait in the darkness beyond the road. In his toolbox, he kept a small token from that night, a rusted nail taken from the altar, wrapped in cloth, a reminder, a warning. He never told anyone why he kept it, but sometimes, late at night, he could swear it felt warm. Mario had been working as a cab driver in New Orleans for nearly a decade. He'd seen his share of strange riders, tourists drunk on Bourbon Street, people whispering nonsense in the back seat. But nothing prepared him for what he picked up one stormy night in the Garden District. A woman flagged him down near an old mansion, soaked in rain, dressed in all black. She held a small package wrapped tightly in a towel. "Just drop me off downtown," she said softly. "And don't open this. Ever." Her eyes didn't blink. Once during the ride, the rain pounded hard as Mario drove through the empty streets, windshield wipers screeching against the glass. The woman remained silent the entire time, clutching the bundle like it held something fragile or dangerous. When they reached her stop, she paid cash and stepped out into the darkness without another word. "Hey, your package!" Mario shouted, but she was already gone, swallowed by the storm. He waited a few moments, then set the bundle gently on the passenger seat and drove off, intending to turn it in later. That night, strange things began happening. As he pulled into his driveway, Mario heard a faint crying from the front seat. Confused, he turned around, but the cab was empty. Thinking the sound was from outside, he shrugged it off. But once inside his house, the crying followed. Not loud, but constant, like a baby whimpering through walls. The package sat on his kitchen table now, dripping faintly despite being dry moments earlier. The air in the room grew thick. The lights flickered. Something was wrong. He unwrapped the towel slightly, just enough to peek inside. What he saw didn't make sense. A dead bird, its feathers matted and soaked, covered in white worms. The smell hit him like a punch, but what disturbed him more was that the sound of the crying grew louder the more he stared. He slammed it shut and ran to the backyard, digging a hole beneath the rain to bury it. As he threw dirt over the bundle, the sound finally stopped. Silence returned, but the damage was done. That night, he dreamt of the woman, her eyes bleeding. Black? The next day, Mario visited a local spiritualist, an older woman known for her knowledge of curses and energy. After hearing his story, she paled and asked one question. Was she wearing black with no shoes? Mario nodded. "You were cursed," she said flatly. "That was a gift meant for you. Someone, an ex maybe, sent it through her. It's old magic, personal, and it's not finished with you." She handed him a blessed talisman and told him to never drive at night again. "The crying will return," she warned, "and next time, it won't just be crying." Over the next week, Mario's cab refused to start after sunset. Mechanics found nothing wrong. At home, puddles of water began appearing near doors and windows, even on dry nights. He heard fluttering behind walls, like wings trapped in wood. One night, while cleaning his car, he found white feathers under the passenger seat. He hadn't seen them before. They were soaked. The crying returned, not outside but from the glove compartment. Mario locked the car and backed away, praying under his breath. Friends began to notice changes in him. Sunken eyes, nervous tics, a quiet paranoia. When asked, he simply said he wasn't sleeping well. But the truth was, he could feel it. Something following him. In mirrors behind him, he caught glimpses of the woman in black. Never full on, just shapes, a presence. Sometimes it wasn't her. It was the bird, eyes gone, beak open in a scream. He thought about leaving town, but the spiritualist warned him, "This was tied to your soul. Distance means nothing." Eventually, Mario stopped driving altogether. He sold his taxi, burned the seat cushions, and started working nights at a diner instead. He felt safer around people, under bright fluorescent lights. But sometimes even there he'd hear the faint echo of a baby crying. It would stop the moment someone looked at him. Customers would ask, "Did you hear that?" And Mario would smile and lie. "No, just the air vents." He carried the talisman everywhere now, tucked beneath his uniform. The spiritualist passed away months later. After her death, things escalated. Mario's dreams grew more vivid. He'd wake up with feathers on his chest, sometimes small cuts on his arms. One night he found the package again on his front step, exactly as before. Same towel, same shape. This time he didn't open it. He drove it out to the bayou and sank it in the deepest water he could find. When he returned, his house was silent. That silence felt worse than any sound. To this day, Mario avoids side streets near the Garden District. Sometimes when it rains hard enough, he swears he sees her, standing under the same flickering street lamp, barefoot, holding nothing. Waiting for someone new. The kind of person who won't ask questions. The kind of driver desperate for a fare. He's told himself he was lucky, but deep down, Mario knows luck had nothing to do with it. You don't escape a curse, you just carry it quietly and pray it doesn't find a reason to come back. It was just past 9 p.m. in Flagstaff, Arizona, when Hector picked up a family outside a grocery store. A mother, her little boy, and 2 shopping bags climbed into his cab. The mother gave the address of a motel on the edge of town and smiled politely, clearly exhausted. The boy, no older than 6, sat silently in the middle of the back seat. His eyes scanned the ceiling, then the windows, then the floor, as if expecting something to happen. Hector didn't think much of it. Kids acted strangely sometimes. But then the boy started to cry. Not a tantrum or a whimper. This was different. A slow, terrified sobbing, the kind that comes from a place of pure fear. The mother turned to him, visibly confused. "What's wrong, baby?" she whispered. But the boy didn't respond. He just stared at the corner of the cab's interior, shaking his head, saying, "He's here again." Hector felt the hairs rise on his neck. "Who's here? The Mother asked. The boy didn't look at her. The man with no mouth. Hector's hands tightened on the wheel. The ride grew painfully quiet. The boy kept his face hidden, buried in his mom's jacket. Hector tried to change the subject, asking about the weather, the motel, anything to lighten the mood. The mother answered robotically, distracted by her son's behavior. The moment they reached their destination, the boy screamed, "Don't let him out! He's in the seat!" The mother, embarrassed and flustered, grabbed the boy and rushed out. Hector sat frozen, staring at the now empty seat the child had pointed to. He looked behind him. Nothing, but a strange cold clung to the back seat, like condensation on glass. Hector turned off the car and stepped out for air. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Something about the child's scream echoed in his head. He's in the seat. That night, Hector didn't take another fare. He drove straight home and parked the cab outside, leaving it locked. But at exactly 3:17 a.m., the horn blared by itself. Lights flickered, and the back door slowly opened with a click. In the following days, Hector noticed strange behavior in other children who rode with him. A toddler screamed until she was removed from the car. Another refused to sit on the left side of the back seat. Dogs barked when they walked near the cab. One child, barely old enough to speak, whispered, "He's hiding." Adults noticed nothing. It was only the young and the animals. Hector began driving with the windows cracked and a crucifix hanging from the mirror. But the tension remained, thick as smoke. One night he installed a dash cam, just to prove to himself he wasn't imagining things. Reviewing the footage, everything seemed normal, until a freeze frame at 2:41 a.m. showed something impossible, a faint shape in the back seat, barely visible. A man with no mouth, no eyes, just smooth skin and a hollow presence. The image glitched and vanished. Hector deleted it immediately, but the damage was done. He began hearing breathing behind him during empty rides. Low, steady, and unnatural. Sleep became a struggle. Hector dreamt of children pointing at him, screaming silently. In the dream, he was always in the driver's seat, trapped, unable to move, the mirrors showing a face behind him that didn't exist. He contacted a priest who offered to bless the car. During the blessing, the engine started on its own. The crucifix spun wildly. A sudden foul stench filled the air before vanishing. The priest said nothing, only looked at Hector with solemn pity. "You picked up something you weren't meant to," he said. The boy and his mother never called again. No records of the motel they stayed at existed. Hector checked. Nothing. It was as if they'd vanished after that night. He tried to rationalize it, but the fear lived in his bones. He began taking public transportation instead of driving. He left his taxi job altogether. But sometimes passing a parked cab on the street, he'd feel that same chill, like someone or something was still watching. He tried to sell the cab, but no buyer would follow through. One said the car made them dizzy. Another claimed they saw someone sitting inside when it was empty. Eventually, Hector stopped trying and had the vehicle towed and crushed. He watched it fold into itself like a coffin. But even now, when he dreams, he's back in that seat, staring into the mirror, hearing a child cry in the distance. And behind him, always behind him, sits the man with no mouth, waiting. Santiago had always believed in logic. He drove a taxi in Savannah, Georgia, and didn't have time for ghost stories or urban legends. But after a series of late-night rides in the historic district, even his skepticism began to crack. Passengers mentioned odd chills, sudden nausea, or feeling watched in the back seat. One woman got out mid-ride, refusing to finish the trip. "There's something wrong with your car," she whispered before slamming the door. Santiago laughed it off, but over the following weeks, things escalated, and laughter gave way to fear. It began with noises, low whispers like a radio stuck between stations. Then came the scent, something metallic and rotten, appearing without warning, vanishing just as fast. At times, the mirrors fogged over while he drove, even with the windows down. One night, as he reached to adjust his rear view, he saw a face, hollow, wide-eyed, sitting behind him. But when he turned around, the seat was empty. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't want to sound insane, but every ride after midnight began to feel like a trap. The turning point came during a ride near Colonial Park Cemetery. A woman in her 60s flagged him down and climbed into the back seat. After a few blocks, she leaned forward and asked quietly, "Do you know what's in this car with us?" Santiago went cold. She continued, her voice steady. "You need to cleanse this vehicle. There's pain soaked into these seats." Screaming. "Souls, you've been driving with them." She handed him a small vial of holy water and a rosary. "Burn sage, use salt, and pray," she said, stepping out before he could respond. That night, he did as she instructed. He parked by the river and circled the car with salt. He sprinkled holy water across the dashboard, muttering prayers he hadn't said in decades. As he lit sage and opened all the doors, the wind died completely. Then came the noise, wailing, from inside the car. No passengers, no radio, just shrill, disembodied screams echoing from the floorboards and vents. Santiago dropped the vial and backed away, tears forming. The cries faded as the smoke filled the cabin. He didn't sleep that night. The sound of the wailing haunted him long after the ritual. Over the next few days, things calmed slightly. No more faces, no whispers, but the silence didn't feel clean. It felt temporary, like something waiting to return. A week later, during a midday ride, a child turned to his mother and said, "I don't like the crying car." Santiago slammed the brakes. The mother laughed awkwardly. Santiago didn't. He realized the presence was still there, muted but not gone. He returned to the cemetery, hoping to find the woman again, but no one matching her description had been seen. He left an offering near the gate, flowers, coins, and a note that read, "Thank you." The next day, a cross was etched into his windshield. He hadn't done it. Unsure whether it was a threat or a blessing, he drove to a nearby church. The priest listened patiently, then nodded. "Your car needs to go," he said. Sometimes, places hold memories, but so do things. Reluctantly, Santiago listed the cab for sale. A young man offered cash on the spot. As the buyer sat inside to test it, Santiago noticed his smile fade. The man got out quickly. "No thanks," he muttered, walking away. 3 more buyers did the same. One claimed he heard scratching in the trunk. Another saw fog inside the locked car. Santiago knew what it meant. The vehicle was no longer his to sell. It had chosen him or marked him. Either way, it wasn't letting go. Desperate, he tried leaving it parked far from home. But within a day, it was towed back. Not by police, but returned by someone unknown, with the keys left neatly on his doorstep. No note, just silence. Ozzy began dreaming of the car chasing him, headlights glowing like eyes. In one nightmare, he opened the trunk and found himself inside. He'd wake drenched in sweat, gasping for air. By now, he'd stopped working completely. He lived off savings and avoided going near the driveway. Months passed. One rainy morning, Santiago gathered the courage to drive the car one last time, to a scrapyard. But just before turning the key, he heard it again. The cry, faint but unmistakable. "No," he whispered, stepping away. He grabbed a hammer and shattered the windshield, then slashed the tires, pouring salt into the cabin. He lit a candle and left it burning in the front seat. Then he walked away and never returned. The scrapyard called days later. "Your car's gone," the owner said. "It vanished, like someone came and drove it off." Now Santiago takes the bus. He doesn't speak of the cab. He keeps the rosary by his bed and never drives after dark. Sometimes he sees a taxi parked across the street. Same model, same color, but it's never running, never moving. He pulls the curtains tight and prays, because deep down he knows the exorcism wasn't enough. It never was. In Denver, Colorado, Mateo had grown used to strange passengers. He'd seen everything from blackout drunks to silent businessmen with odd requests, but nothing disturbed him more than the night a tall man in a gray coat flagged him down near Union Station. The man spoke slowly, almost dreamlike, and asked for a ride. Nowhere specific, just drive. His tone wasn't threatening, but something in it felt rehearsed. Mateo, needing the money, agreed and started the meter. They drove in silence through the city's dark arteries, windows fogging despite the heater. The man never said a word after that. He just stared out the window, fingers tapping the seat rhythmically. After 20 minutes, he tapped Mateo on the shoulder and asked to be let out at an intersection near an industrial zone. No buildings, no lights, no other people. As Mateo stopped the car, the man leaned in and said, "Thanks for the ride, don't look back." He stepped out, leaving something on the back seat. Mateo waited until the man vanished into the shadows, then turned to check. A shallow ceramic plate sat in the center of the seat, neatly placed, and inside it, what looked unmistakably like a human eye. Mateo's stomach turned. At first, he thought it was a prank, maybe a hyper-realistic prop, but the eye twitched. Reflexively, he jumped out of the car and vomited onto the pavement. When he returned, the plate was still there. He wrapped it in a towel and drove to the nearest police station. But when he arrived, something even stranger happened. The plate was empty. He tried to explain to the officer on duty what had happened, but without the evidence, he sounded insane. They humored him, filed a minimal report, and sent him on his way. That night, he barely slept. And when he did, he dreamt of the man's face, blank, unblinking. Worse, in the dream, he was holding the plate himself, offering the eye to someone else. The next morning, he found his rearview mirror cracked straight down the center. No one had touched the car. Over the following days, Mateo began noticing things. His left eye, his vision, began to blur randomly like something was blocking it. A dull ache settled behind it, constant and heavy. He visited doctors, but they found nothing. Some nights, he'd catch glimpses of the man in gray in his mirror, just standing silently in the back seat, only to disappear when he turned. One morning, he woke up with blood on his pillow and a small dish on his nightstand. Empty, but familiar. The fear took root. He stopped driving late, avoided downtown altogether. One evening, while cleaning the cab, he found a note under the seat in tight, slanted handwriting, "Return what was taken." He hadn't taken anything, he didn't even want it, but whatever he had picked up that night, whoever that man truly was, had left something more than just a physical object. Matteo felt watched constantly. As if that one ride had linked them in a way he couldn't undo, he turned to a local occult shop for answers. The shopkeeper, an older woman with pale eyes, listened quietly. "An eye is the window of perception," she said. "He gave you his sight. Now he sees through you. Every time you look into a mirror, so does he." Matteo begged for a way to sever the connection. She handed him a black candle, an obsidian stone, and instructions to perform a ritual under a new moon. "But be warned," she said. "You must not look into any reflection until it's done." That night, Matteo blacked out the bathroom mirror and unplugged every reflective surface. He followed the instructions precisely. As he lit the final wick, a sudden pressure filled the room as if the air itself thickened. Whispers circled his ears. He heard the man's voice behind him. "Now you see what I see." Then silence. The flame extinguished. When Matteo opened his eyes, the ache was gone. His vision was clear, but something was different. The shadows moved when they shouldn't. The next day, he felt like himself again. No pain, no visions. He began to believe. The ritual had worked, until he received a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for keeping me in sight." No name, just those words. That night his eye throbbed once more. In the mirror, the reflection didn't blink when he did. It just stared back, unblinking, patient, wrong. Matteo covered all his mirrors, drove only in daylight. But the feeling never left. The man hadn't just left something behind, he had moved in. Now Matteo doesn't drive anymore. He avoids all glass, lives in a cluttered studio with curtains drawn tight. He speaks less, sleeps little, but he knows one thing for certain. Some fares don't end when the ride is over. Some passengers don't need a return trip. They stay with you, watching, waiting, until the next eye opens. It was nearly 2 a.m. in Charleston, South Carolina, when Victor picked up a well-dressed businessman outside a hotel near the harbor. The man seemed anxious, constantly glancing over his shoulder. He got into the back seat and politely nodded. "Northbridge area, please," he said. As Victor pulled into traffic, the man looked into the mirror and asked, "Can she come too?" Victor turned, confused, until he noticed a pale woman seated quietly beside the man, thin, expressionless, dressed in a faded white blouse. She hadn't opened the door. He hadn't seen her enter. But there she was. The man's tone changed, tense, like trying to keep it together. "She doesn't talk much, but she wants to come." Victor nodded slowly, heart pounding. The woman stared straight ahead, eyes cloudy like fogged glass. Her hands rested on her lap, unmoving. Every few minutes she blinked, nothing else. The air in the cab grew colder, thick with tension. Victor gripped the wheel tighter. Something about her presence drained the air from the cabin. As they drove, through winding streets, Victor noticed something stranger. In every mirror, the woman appeared clearer than in real life, sharper, more present. In the mirror, she would sometimes look directly into his eyes. Outside the mirror, her head never moved. Victor began to sweat. "She doesn't like when people stare," the businessman whispered. "She only shows herself to certain drivers." Victor swallowed hard and focused on the road. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. When they reached the destination, the man paid and stepped out. Victor turned to say goodbye, but the woman was gone. The door hadn't opened, there was no sound, just an empty seat. He sat there in silence, heart racing. Then, from the back seat, a whisper, "Thank you for the ride." He turned quickly. No one there. Victor leapt out of the car and paced on the sidewalk, trying to calm down. That night he barely slept. The whisper echoed in his ears. The next morning, Victor checked the cab's internal camera. The footage showed only the businessman in the back seat. No sign of the woman. Not during the ride, not at the stop, not in any frame. But at the 19-minute mark, just before they reached the destination, static filled the screen, and a single frame showed a face. Her face, staring into the camera, mouth open wide as if screaming. Victor turned off the video and deleted the file immediately. He started seeing her after that. Not often, just reflections, in store windows, in puddles, in chrome car bumpers. She'd stand just behind him, always quiet. He never heard her speak again, but her expression slowly changed, from neutral to something darker, accusatory, angry. One night, while cleaning the cab, he found a long white hair on the headrest. It was freezing to the touch. He knew she'd been there again, and watching. Victor went to a local historian who specialized in Charleston's paranormal past. When he described the woman, the historian's face turned pale. She matches a woman? From an urban legend, the silent passenger. She was killed by her fiancé and buried near the harbor. They say she appears to men traveling with guilt, to remind them or to punish. Victor insisted he had nothing to feel guilty about, but the look in her eyes said otherwise. He tried driving different routes, avoiding the harbor, removing mirrors. None of it worked. The woman always returned, calm at first, but each night her face grew more twisted. One night, during a ride, a child in the back seat burst into tears. "Make the lady stop looking at me," he screamed, but there was no one else in the car. Victor had to pull over. He didn't finish the shift. He didn't drive for weeks. Eventually, he sold the car. The buyer totaled it in less than 24 hours, said he'd swerved to avoid a woman standing in the back seat while he was driving. He survived, but refused to ever speak about what he saw. Victor now lives alone and doesn't use mirrors at all. He sometimes hears her whisper just before falling asleep, "You saw me, and now I see you." He keeps a light on every night. Because in darkness, he fears he might see her again, closer than ever. It was near midnight in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when Julian received a hail from a young man on the edge of the highway, near a gas station that had long been abandoned. The kid looked disoriented, mud on his jeans, blood dried on one arm, a backpack half-zipped. He waved frantically and Julian stopped without thinking. "My dad, he's down the road," the boy gasped. "He helped me out of the woods. We need to go pick him up." Julian opened the door without hesitation. Something in the boy's desperation was too real to ignore. They drove 10 minutes into a wooded area where the trees swallowed the moonlight. Julian's headlights finally caught a tall man in a flannel shirt standing calmly by the roadside. He didn't wave, didn't move, just stared as the car pulled up. The boy jumped out and ran to him. The man said nothing, just placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Thanks for coming," the boy said. "He doesn't talk much since the accident." Julian nodded and opened the back door for them both. The man sat silently beside his son. His eyes were distant, his movements stiff. The ride was quiet. Julian tried to strike up conversation, but the father never spoke. The boy told him they'd gotten lost while hiking, said his dad found him just in time. "He was already waiting for me when I woke up," the boy added. "It was like he knew I needed him." Julian smiled politely but kept glancing at the man in the rear view. Something didn't feel right, something too still. As they neared the city limits, the father finally spoke, just one sentence. "I'm only here for the goodbye." Then he looked out the window again. The boy's face fell. "I know," he whispered, almost to himself. Julian felt his skin crawl. When they arrived at the address the boy had given, the house was dark, clearly abandoned. Weeds crawled up the walls, windows were boarded. This is it?" Julian asked. The boy blinked in confusion. "This is where we lived," he said. Before the crash, Julian stepped out and checked the mailbox, covered in rust, filled with cobwebs. The number was right, but the place had been vacant for years. When he turned back, the boy was crying softly. "He said I had to come here to let him go." Julian turned to the back seat. The father was gone. The door hadn't opened. The boy looked up at him, tear-streaked. "He was never really here, was he?" Julian couldn't answer. The air was thick. The car smelled like forest soil. Julian drove the boy to a nearby station and called social services. A kind woman came to pick him up. Before leaving, the boy handed Julian something wrapped in cloth. "He wanted you to have this," he said. When Julian unwrapped it later, it was a worn compass engraved on the back, "For when you feel lost." That night, Julian didn't sleep. He kept seeing the man's face, calm and distant, staring into the dark. A protector, or a ghost, still tethered by love. Over the next few weeks, Julian began to see him again, not clearly, just silhouettes near the roadside in wooded patches. Once, while driving past the crash site listed in the paper, he saw two figures walking side by side, the man and the boy, hand in hand. When he blinked, they were gone. He told no one. It felt sacred, like violating a moment that wasn't meant to be witnessed. But he knew what he had seen, and it brought something unexpected. Peace. Julian kept the compass in his glove box. Every time he got lost in thought or felt uncertain, he'd open it. The needle didn't always point north. Sometimes it spun slowly as if unsure, but eventually it always settled. One night a passenger noticed it. "Looks old," they said. Julian smiled. It belonged to someone who never gave up, even after death. He didn't elaborate. Some things can't be explained, only carried. He still drives nights occasionally, but never questions odd encounters. Once he gave a ride to a young woman who vanished before paying. Instead, she left a necklace on the seat. Another time, a child told him a dead grandmother had just waved goodbye to them in the rearview mirror. Julian no longer fears these moments. He respects them. In a strange way, they made him feel less alone, less disconnected from the world's invisible threads. To this day, Julian sometimes parks near the crash site, just to listen, just to remember. He doesn't know if the father found peace, but he knows the boy was saved, guided by something far beyond this world. And when Julian closes his eyes, he still hears the man's last words. "I'm only here for the goodbye." Words that echo like a final promise, one that still lingers in the space between the living and the dead. It was a stormy night in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when Elias received a request from a blocked number. The location was a quiet street lined with Victorian homes, most of them empty or abandoned. When he arrived, a woman stood at the curb wearing an old-fashioned black dress and veil soaked in rain. She didn't speak. She simply opened the door, sat in the back seat, and handed Elias a slip of paper with an address scribbled in faded ink. He started the engine, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the downpour. As he drove, Elias stole glances in the rearview mirror. The woman never moved. Her hands were folded in her lap, and beneath the veil, her face was pale, almost translucent. The address led to a part of town he didn't recognize, deep in the hills beyond the industrial districts. No GPS signal, just the winding road and the strange silence. Even the rain seemed quieter around her. Elias tried to make conversation, but she never answered. Only the occasional sound of fabric rustling in the back seat. After nearly 30 minutes, they arrived at a crumbling house on the edge of the woods. It looked lifeless. Windows shattered, vines creeping up the sides, porch half collapsed. "Are you sure?" Elias asked, turning around. But the back seat was empty. The door had never opened. The woman had vanished. In her place sat a small locket, glinting under the dome light. Elias stepped out, heart racing, and approached the house. Something compelled him, not fear, but sorrow. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and silence. A broken picture frame lay near the entryway, and old children's shoes sat near the fireplace, untouched by time. On the wall, a burned photo showed the same woman in black, holding a baby. A newspaper clipping lay folded on the floor. Mother. Loses family in fire 1924, disappears days later. Elias backed away, chills running through his spine. He left the locket on the windowsill and returned to the cab. But when he turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. A faint humming came from the back seat, a lullaby. The same melody repeated, soft and aching. Elias didn't dare look. He exited the car and walked until he found a signal, then called for a tow. When the truck arrived, the driver asked why there were small handprints on the fogged windows. Elias didn't answer. He never spoke of it. But something followed him from that house. The lullaby returned some nights, playing through the vents. The smell of smoke lingered in his clothes. Later, Elias learned that the house had long been considered cursed. Locals believed the woman still roamed the hills, trying to reach her family. She was last seen walking along the very road Elias had taken days before her own death. Passengers began complaining about the cold in his car, even during summer. One woman left mid-ride, claiming someone was breathing down her neck. Elias tried cleansing the vehicle, hanging charms, even lighting. Candles, but nothing stopped the lullaby. The woman appeared again, twice. Once in his mirror, just a flicker. Another time in a dream, standing at the foot of his bed, holding the locket. "They're still in the house," she whispered. "I can't find them." Elias began driving less, limiting his hours to daylight. Only. He still felt her sometimes, like a weight in the back seat. He no longer used that part of town. He even changed his number to avoid more unlisted calls. But the memory clung to him. Eventually, Elias placed the locket in a church donation box and said a prayer. That night, the lullaby stopped, but the silence that replaced it was heavier than sound. He knew it hadn't ended, just paused, as if the woman was waiting, watching, hoping someone else would follow her path to the house. Others might not believe his story, but he had no doubt. Her grief was too strong to vanish. It had soaked into his car, into him. He now drives a different vehicle, newer, brighter. But sometimes, while cleaning the back seat, he finds ash, fine gray, clinging to the fabric. The mechanic says it's from air pollution. Elias says nothing, but he knows better. He knows grief doesn't die, it lingers. And the woman in black will never stop looking for her family, not until someone finds them or joins her. It was a foggy dawn in Richmond, Virginia, when Thomas accepted a ride request from an elderly woman near an old church cemetery. She wore a faded shawl and a long gray coat, her hands shaking slightly as she stepped into the cab. "Please," she said softly, "my daughter is lost in the cemetery. We have to find her." Her voice was brittle, weighed down by age and something deeper, grief. Thomas hesitated but nodded. The woman clutched a worn photograph in her hand, folded and stained by time. As they drove the short distance into the cemetery grounds, the steaming sun began to rise behind the clouds, casting faint orange light through the mist. "She wandered off," the woman whispered. "I saw her just before dusk yesterday. She was chasing a red balloon." Thomas raised an eyebrow. Her daughter. He assumed she meant a caregiver or granddaughter, but the woman didn't explain. Instead, she clutched the photo tighter. "She's so small, always afraid of the dark." Her voice broke, and Thomas felt a pang of unease in his chest. They reached the cemetery gate. The woman insisted on being dropped at a path leading into the older section. Thomas offered to wait, but she smiled sadly. "She'll come back with me this time. I just needed help getting here." She got out slowly, then paused. "If she speaks to you, don't answer." The wind picked up suddenly, tossing leaves across the path. Thomas watched her disappear into the mist between crumbling headstones, her figure shrinking until it vanished completely. Something told him to leave, but he stayed. Minutes passed, then an hour, no sign of her. Concerned, Thomas stepped out and walked into the cemetery, calling for her. Only silence answered. Finally, he reached a bench near a small family mausoleum. On the bench sat the photograph the woman had carried. He picked it up. His breath caught in his throat. The picture showed the same woman, but much younger, holding the hand of a small child in front of a grave. Scrawled on the back, Eleanor and Clara, 1932. The names matched several headstones nearby. Thomas backed away, heart pounding. Then came the laughter, a child's giggle, high and distant. A red balloon floated through the fog and brushed his arm before drifting upward and vanishing into the trees. He turned to run, but standing by his cab was the same little girl from the photograph, pale skin, hollow eyes. "I want to go home," she said. Thomas froze. The warning echoed in his mind. "Don't answer." So he said nothing. The girl tilted her head, then slowly faded into mist. When Thomas returned to the cab, the passenger seat was soaked, as if someone had been sitting there in the rain. The smell of old flowers and damp earth filled the vehicle. He drove off quickly, heart racing, glancing into the mirror every few seconds. He didn't stop until he reached a busy gas station miles away. He checked the seat, empty, but a small damp handprint remained on the window. It disappeared before his eyes. He didn't speak a word of it for days. Eventually, he returned to the cemetery with a local historian. The man confirmed the story. Eleanor and Clara had died in a fire nearly a century ago. The mother was last seen wandering the cemetery years later, confused and calling for her daughter. Since then, dozens of people had claimed to see the two, sometimes together, sometimes alone. Most believed the mother's soul never moved on, still searching. "And if you see the daughter," the historian said gravely, "don't speak to her, she leads people away." Thomas started sleeping with lights on. He drove only during daylight, but he kept the photograph, now dried and flat, tucked under the dashboard. It reminded him that not every haunting is malevolent. Some are echoes of love too powerful to let go, but he also never forgot the girl's voice, sweet, deceptive, empty. He never heard it again, but sometimes, in dense fog, he sees a red balloon drifting past his windshield, then vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Other drivers began to report similar sightings, red balloons on empty roads, childlike laughter heard near cemeteries. Thomas never confirmed or denied what happened to him, but he quietly warned every new cab driver in the area, "If a little girl asks to go home, don't answer." He never explained. Most laughed it off. A few didn't. One even quit after a night shift near that same church, pale and shaking. Some stories don't need proof, just a whisper, just a red balloon. It was the end of the month, and Marcus was behind on rent. Driving nights in Detroit had become more dangerous lately, but the bills didn't care. That evening, he turned off the app's safety filter, something he'd never done before. It opened up the more desperate areas of the city. Riskier zones meant higher fares, and Marcus needed every dollar. As midnight crept in, a ping came from a rundown warehouse district. He accepted it without hesitation. He didn't know this would be the ride that changed everything. A man in a hoodie and sunglasses stepped into the cab, even though it was pitch black. He didn't speak at first, just gave Marcus a crumpled slip of paper with an address written in shaky handwriting. "Drive. No questions." Marcus glanced in the mirror. The man's face was tense, lips twitching slightly. Something about him felt off, like he was too calm for someone clearly on edge. But money was money, and Marcus had already said yes. The cab rolled out into the empty streets. As they drove deeper into the industrial zone, the man began to mutter to himself, "She told me not to do it. She begged me." Marcus gripped the wheel tighter, wondering if he should end the ride early. Then the man pulled out a small revolver and placed it gently on his lap. "I won't use it on you," he said. "Just don't stop driving." Marcus's blood ran cold. He nodded silently. The road stretched on like a bad dream. Each second, heavier than the last, they reached a decrepit building near the river. "Wait here," the man said and stepped out. He entered through a rusted side door and disappeared. Marcus thought of leaving. His hands were shaking, but something told him to stay. Moments later, a gunshot rang out, then another. Silence. Marcus opened the door, ready to flee, but the man reappeared, drenched in blood. "Drive," he said. "I had to do it." She was already gone. Marcus didn't ask questions. He hit the gas. As they sped away, the man leaned forward and whispered, "You ever see someone dead, but still breathing?" Marcus didn't reply. The man wept quietly, his blood-soaked hands trembling. It wasn't her anymore. It had her voice, but it wasn't her. Eyes all black, like a hole opened up inside her. Marcus didn't know if he was hearing the ramblings of a madman or something worse. But the man wasn't lying. His grief was real, and something in his voice chilled Marcus to the bone. They reached the drop-off point, a boarded-up motel on the city's edge. "You've done enough," the man said. "She won't come looking for me now." He placed a thick envelope on the front seat and walked into the shadows. Marcus waited 5 minutes, then drove away. He never saw him again. But when he opened the envelope later, it was filled with old bills, some dated decades back. And beneath them, a photograph, a woman with black eyes smiling. After that night, Marcus changed. He never accepted cash rides. He avoided warehouse zones. Still, strange things followed him. Passengers complained about cold spots. Others claimed someone else was in the car with them. Once, a teenage girl screamed and demanded to be let out, saying a woman was sitting on the floor by her feet. Marcus checked. Nothing. But the floor mat was wet, like someone had just stepped in from the rain. Eventually, he tried to track down the man's name, the address, anything. But there were no records. The warehouse had burned down weeks earlier. No police report matched the story. The motel was demolished years ago. Even the photograph began to fade unnaturally fast, like it didn't want to be seen. Marcus threw it away, but days later, it reappeared under his wiper blade. He left it at a church altar. That night, he heard whispers in his hallway. Someone crying outside his door. He told himself it was guilt, maybe trauma, but deep down he knew better. That man had run from something not fully human anymore, and Marcus had helped him escape, or maybe had helped it follow him. Now each night he hears the click of a revolver in his dreams, a woman's voice humming, a shadow at the foot of his bed, waiting. He sleeps with the lights on and the radio playing softly, hoping it'll drown out whatever tries to come through. Now Marcus drives during the day only. He wears a cross around his neck and keeps salt in the glove box, but he knows none of it truly matters. Once you open the door for darkness, it remembers you. It leaves its scent, its shadow, its voice. He no longer fears passengers. He fears the space between them. The one seat no one ever fills but always feels full. The one where she sometimes whispers, "You shouldn't have helped him." These weren't urban legends. They weren't tales made to scare children. They were lived by men and women whose only mistake was picking up the wrong fare. Some of them still drive. Others vanished without a trace. And a few left behind stories that are whispered among taxi drivers like prayers in a storm. They speak of cold seats, mirrors that lie, and passengers who never opened a door but still left something behind. Because after a certain hour, the cool road changes. It becomes a thread between two worlds, one of asphalt and headlights, the other of silence and shadow. And when the wrong spirit finds its way into the cab, it doesn't always go quietly. Some leave curses, others leave questions. But the most dangerous ones, they leave memories, the kind that whisper when you're alone and watch when you're not. We often think the real horror lives in monsters, in murderers, in haunted houses. But sometimes the scariest place is the space right behind you, the back seat where something breathes, waits, and listens. These drivers weren't looking for horror. They were just trying to survive the night. But the night had other plans. So next time you take a cab or flag down a ride on a quiet street, look twice at the driver's eyes. If they seem distant, if their hands tremble slightly, if the mirror looks fogged for no reason, it might be because they've seen what most never should. And if you ever hear a whisper from the seat behind you, don't answer. Just pray. The door opens again. If these stories sent a chill down your spine, share them. Comment below with what you think really happened. And remember, some passengers never leave, and some roads should never be driven alone.